Coming off the high that was Star Trek First Contact, Insurrection should have been so much more, but instead it plays like a revamped version of a bunch of old episodes. Picard has to save some space hippies, who seem like they live in the Napa Valley. It all turns into a Fountain of Youth analogy, with another half-baked romance for Picard. And making the film doubly disappointing is the fact that it was written by the late great Next Generation showrunner, Michael Piller. Nemesis barely avoids the bottom spot here, if only because it's more memorable than Insurrection. While the film has an intriguing premise, dealing with a clone of Picard who comes back to haunt the crew, the franchise was really showing its age at this point. But you know, you kinda can't go wrong with a young Tom Hardy as evil Picard. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier is certainly the low point of the original crew's movie adventures. Directed by William Shatner himself, the film tries to capitalize on the humor that worked so well in the last film, The Voyage Home, but it often misses the mark, making the jokes at the expense of its characters.
I know this ship like the back of my hand.
It has its moments though, as when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are asked to face their greatest fears. Plus, it gave us this classic line.
What does God need with a starship?
The first Star Trek movie ever, the motion picture was an expensive, high-end epic when compared to many of the films that followed. Kirk is now an admiral, and he's reunited with his crew to confront the massive space puzzle known as Voyager. Unfortunately, the film is kind of a slog, long, slow, and doing its best Stanley Kubrick impression. But there's a philosophical question at the heart of Voyager's story, the kind that you'll find in the best of Trek. In the end, Voyager is just asking the same thing we all do at one time or another.
Is this all that I am? Is there nothing more?
How very human of it. In 1994, Star Trek Generations took Picard's crew to the big screen, while also bringing Kirk back just long enough for him to pass off the baton, and then do this. But while Generations is far from a perfect film, it's frequently a very heartfelt one, and seriously, if you're gonna kill off Captain Kirk, who better to do it than this guy? Search for Spock undoes much of what was great about its immediate predecessor, The Wrath of Khan, but it's so much fun that you can hardly blame it. In fact, this is probably the Trek movie that's most like an episode of the old show, right down to the fisticuffs between Kirk and the borderline camp villain played by Christopher Lloyd.
Give me Genesis!
By the time Kirk realizes he must sacrifice the Enterprise to save his friend, well, he may very well wind up crying. For a starship.
My God, Bones. What have I done?
The Next Generation crew had their greatest success on the big screen with First Contact. Bringing the classic villains the Borg into the mix proved to be the perfect way to attract the non-Trekkie audience. And the Trekkies too, of course.
Assimilate this.
Riker himself, Jonathan Frakes, directed this one, combining cool action with a good dose of humor, and some pretty creepy moments as well. It's actually a pretty densely packed film, with time travel, the first warp flight in Star Trek's history, and even a Deep Space Nine shout-out. But it's Picard's struggle that drives the film, haunted as he is by these robotic boogeymen from his past.
I will make them pay for what they've done.
The Undiscovered Country does what the greatest Star Trek stories do. It's a metaphor for what was happening in the world when it was made. That means that in Captain Kirk's final mission, he must help tear down the Berlin Wall. Or the Klingon equivalent, anyway. And you know how Kirk feels about those Klingons.
Let them die.
Full of intrigue, it's refreshing how the film is willing to break with some of Star Trek's stodgy old ideals. Yeah, sometimes the good guys can be bad guys. Exciting, fun, and touching, it's the perfect swan song for the classic crew. J.J. Abrams made Star Trek viable again in 2009 with his big-budget reboot. The film was flashy and exciting, and it won over mainstream audiences in a big way. True, Abrams played fast and loose with Trek continuity, but dropping that very continuity and starting from scratch is undoubtedly one of the film's greatest strengths, and it leaves this new Star Trek free to chart its own course. Another Star Trek film that was able to reach across the aisle is The Voyage Home, which brought a new level of humor to Kirk's crew in their big screen adventures.
Double dumbass on you!
The gang must save the future by going back to the past. They also have to save the whales, which is about as on the nose as you can get for a franchise famous for its social conscience. But it works. It's actually great, and after all the heartache and heavy lifting of the first 3 films, the light tone here is something of a revelation.
Admiral, there be whales here!
Without a doubt the best of the franchise, Wrath of Khan brought color and life back to the Enterprise after the drab first film in the series. Director Nicholas Meyer also made this episode personal for Kirk. Not only must he face a demon from his past, but he must also confront a true unknown to him, the prospect of losing, the prospect of death. Star Trek II cleverly calls out to the old TV show, while also expanding on it, bringing in a next generation of characters, if you will, that unfortunately didn't last much past this film. Packed with action, heart, and wisdom, The Wrath of Khan has been, and always shall be, the greatest Star Trek film of them all.
I feel young.